Hi all, I'm Pranav. I'm going to be talking or going over round one of Australs. There'll be two sections to this video. The first is I will do topic selection or have a brief discussion around what topics you could pick. And then I will just pick a topic and go over the gov and op. So on the motions themselves, there are a couple of things to say. So on the motion on like opposing court mandated men's behavior change programs, Gov may at first at least have some apprehensiveness towards picking this because it might seem like an intuitively good idea. I do still think there are like a lot of good govs in many instances around whether these government run initiatives will actually get sufficient funding to actually have enough efficacy, or around how, if they are designed to combat gendered violence, they often seem like they're coming in with a specific agenda, like, focus highly on societal factors around women when you are trying to talk to men, or when you're talking about root issues like unresolved childhood trauma or emotional regulation, sound like you're always like beating in messages around how you shouldn't like harm or mistreat women. And the problem with these is that, especially with some women who are like convicted of an offense and compelled to be attending to it, these either are ineffective, they may actually cause them to lash out, they may even make like the quality of, especially if it's a government run issue, they often tend to be like group therapy sessions, so it may even be like deeply like create a lot of vitiated. So there are a lot of govs, but I can understand if gov is a little bit apprehensive of it because there probably might be benefits, obviously, especially for men who do this voluntarily, to try and help get resolving further issues like trauma, and they can open up to men a lot more. The other motion on opposing bans on sex selective abortions, again, Gov may have some apprehensiveness over this, because it might sound like at times they run the risk of like seeming to be pro like female infanticide if it's women, which is the sex, or female is the sex that's, chosen for an abortion. To be clear here, this is about opposing the ban on it. So you can also just make generally good Gov arguments around how, like the ban itself is deeply ineffective. Like probably having these abortions that would happen anyways in backroom alleys, as opposed to, within, say, like good treated hospitals, that it could in and of itself be, a reasonably good gov. There could also just be govs around how like abortions in general should be things that are not banned, and why parents have the right to decide on almost any basis what that baby ought to look like, i.e., if they anyways make almost any decision about what that baby ought to look like after birth, like just a level of control over who that girl might be, of over who that child might be and how they grow up to be. If that's okay, then it's also okay to do this. So there are still govs, but again, there may be like some slight apprehension. I think the motion about it being in girls' interest to be sent to single sex schools, at least to me on face, seems immediately or very intuitively like balanced on like a very gut check level. You can think of reasonable govs or ops. I don't think like it requires a lot of thought. So let's work with that motion because I think there's a lot to say about it. So the first thing to figure out is what exactly is in girls' interests. There are two things to say, right? I think one could be said that what's in girls' interest is what happens right now. So Gov may want to frame this is about trying to build up confidence in them today. Trying to, ensure they feel safe and secure in many instances. Basically ensuring they have a good experience in that school right now. Maybe the way Gov wants to phrase girls' interests. Op may want to take like a slightly more longer term point of view. So Op may want to say, look, a big part of what's girls' interests is also a way of how to prepare them to deal with society out there. A society out there that is not single sex, but that is often mixed gender. And Op may want to frame that that's what's in girls' interests. So there already is a clash over here around what girls' interests is more important, and probably both sides will attempt to co opt or suggest that even if the interest that's most important is what the other side says is most important, our side is still able to co-opt it. Gov will still say we can co-opt like, the ability to help women be better integrated into society. And Op may say actually there's some greater level of confidence today in the school. The argumentation can come along several possible clashes or strands. So one clash could just be around, for example, where you may have things like less harassment. So Gov may say, when you don't have to engage with boys as much, you may have lower incidences of sexual harassment and some more worst horrific instances, some assault. You may also just have like less gendered bullying or for example, like less negging from boys in those instances. And even you might feel like you don't have to like be as, aggressively like, like mean or problematic towards boys if you don't have to interact with them. And obviously, a lot of emotional or psychological impacts can arise from this, both today in the school in terms of anxiety and more longer term in terms of like how that affects your self-worth. Um, Op may, for example, try and make the argument that, like apart from the fact that, trying to give a lot of mitigation around like whether this is going to happen to a very significant extent or whether there are regulations you can try and do to reduce it. There may also just be claims around how, like, in the real world, unfortunately, which is mixed gender, they may still face or experience some of these like abuse, or if not abuse, like, negging or like being dismissed in some instances. And what's important in, learning to be in that school from young is to try and figure out either a strategies on how to deal with it. So for example, how to, validate other women in the same classroom when there are boys there. How do you try and build up confidence? Or how exactly do you go to a teacher or a figure in authority and talk to them about sexism? These might be things that are easier to do if, when you're in at an impressionable age, you grow up learning how to do that in a mixed gender classroom. So preparing for the world, for a sexist world, might be easier, as Op might argue. The second possible area of subclash we could talk about is where girls themselves may get a greater level of confidence. So Gov may, for example, say that the value, even outside of like really bad behaviors, is it's just easy to feel way more confident on Gov, right? And there are many possible mechanisms you can give to this. The fact that, for example, you may not feel like you need to be talked over or interrupted or mansplain some things, but even a well-meaning teenage boy or by like a male teacher who's often there in the classroom. These are all things that Gov can argue is essential towards developing your own sense of self-worth and confidence. And Gov will obviously argue that that self-worth or confidence is essential when you do choose to go out into the real world, I guess, into college or into the workplace afterwards, because you feel like you know who you are, you have worth, and that worth has been validated for 18 years, and that allows you to do things like fight back or ask for return, or for like ask for more things for yourself if you need to, like complain to authority figures, not have imposter syndrome in some instances. So many possible impacts that arise out of how you might handle yourself in the real world and how that comes from like having a sense of confidence when younger. Ops flip of this will could obviously be that actually it often doesn't prepare you well for the real world. And the claim will go something like, even if, because I'm sure Gov will make the mitigation that you can still interact with boys outside of the single sex school. Obviously, Op will try and say that, for there to be a meaningful amount of change, probably a lot of these women will spend a lot of their time in the school. And actually, they can even make the argument that many single sex schools in many nations are boarding schools. So you just spend like whole months on months just with the same women in the classroom. So Op can make the claim that actually your confidence plummets, or you feel deeply anxious or depressed or confused when you have to enter into a mixed gender environment for school because you're in college or for the workplace. And that can either make you like increase your imposter syndrome or makes you feel a lot worse because, on both sides, unfortunately, society is sexist. So like the main boss you go to might still be a man, for example. So it might still feel like men are in charge, but you don't have any understanding of not even how to deal with it, but even whether you can deal with it well or not. The very fact that you have to enter into that new atmosphere, dealing with an opposite gender you've never had the same kinds of like interactions with, like you've never had time to develop them with them meaningfully as friends, or even see them as like people in the same way as opposed to like the other gender, those can all be things that cause a lot of level of anxiety and decrease your confidence. There is a third clash, I think, around what the quality of the school itself is. And this is coming down to the characterization of the school. So, for example, I think OP has an interesting claim to make over here that the majority of single sex schools are often like underfunded, just by saying that there is a lot of bias from the government when they are choosing how to apportion money, how much resources to give to them, especially even in many like semi-conservative societies where it's not yet always believed to a widespread degree that girls should get education until the age of 18 as opposed to like until middle school. All of these could be biases that push voters to not donate a lot of money towards this specific school, or for alumni people to like prioritize giving money towards their male child school as opposed to their female child school. And a lot of impacts can just be around how like the facilities in these single sex schools could be bad. There are often too few teachers to take care of your students, and that often reduces your school grades. Around how there often is a perceptive bias when colleges are looking at your application if they think that the school you've gone to is not competitive enough, i.e., it literally like has a curriculum, or literally you are competing against other kids who are not considered to be quote unquote like as good or as smart. So that can happen in a single sex school, and that doesn't happen as much maybe in a mixed gender school because that school is comparatively better funded. The resources or distribution of facilities might be relatively equivalent, just in terms of basic things like textbooks, even or like bathroom facilities, and it could even be like more selective in terms of like counselors, for example, in a mixed gender school. So OP can argue that the quality of the school is essential, and obviously they have to weigh why this is the most important metric. Gov obviously we want to try to strongly mitigate this. And Gov may also have like a couple of interesting flips to try and make to this. For example, Gov can try and argue that in single sex schools actually push up recruitment of female teachers in many contexts. So especially in like some kinds of sexist societies, a disproportionate percentage of teachers in authority figures in like positions of authority may be men, and single sex schools often incentivize or change that. It can also be made that the argument that often single sex schools are disproportionately composed of like only female teachers, and that means a lot of like the biases of male teachers are things women do not have to face or experience when they are a young girl, and that could be good, and that can help them as well. So that's another whole clash there. There's another clash, I think, on say romantic relationships. So, for example, to be clear, this obviously doesn't work for like when you're gay and stuff like that. But probably a significant percentage, probably the majority of relationships, especially in a society that still probably like tells norms first and foremost around like straight people relationships or romantic relationship with the other gender. A lot of young girls and young boys will not have like romantic relationships to the same extent or in the same way, right? On side gov. So one, they may not have it to the same extent. There is no other person you're constantly interacting with on the other gender. And there's a whole clash here around whether this is good or bad, right? So gov can argue that not having romantic relationships, when if you're straight until the age of 18 is helpful. So you often may not have the same level of emotional toxicity because you and the other partner are not like hormonal teens, or they're not having great like variation in your emotions. You're not super emotionally immature, so you often don't have like huge arguments or stuff like that. Or that if it isn't as much gossip or drama, it's just not there, so you often feel less emotionally anxious. And there even could just be a simple claim like even if your relationship is well, if you're a 14 or 15-year-old, they often just break up anyways because at the age of 18 you have to move away to different programs across the country or like go to different workplaces. And Gov just argues like trying to deal with those breakups when you're really young is emotionally devastating. Skip it. When you're at the age of 18, what's really beneficial is you have a clear sense of self and identity, and you already have a clear sense of what your emotional boundaries are because you spent 18 years just like formulating and developing it without feeling like the emotional assault of like hormones or crushes at the age of 14 or 15. And then the way Gov will argue that is that because of this, when you do enter a romantic relationship at the age of 18 and 19, you have confidence, you feel happier or better about yourself, and you even know what you want, right? You have a developed sense of like friends who are able to help you with it. The op version of this is that actually trying to enter into your first relationship at the age of 18 or 19 is much, much worse than getting a dry run at it when you're younger, right? So op can argue that only when you're younger, the ability to have emotion, like to have the right communication with boys, it's easy to do it if you're younger. Because, for example, you may for the first time learn what are the things you might need to say, what is the language you can use, what are the boundaries you want to set in a romantic relationship. It's quite different from what it is to be in a friendship, and that often means for opposition you need that dry run when you're young. And op can even argue like, look, the benefit of it happening, the breakup happening under the age of 18, is that that's when you have your biggest support system. You live with your family, so your parents are still there for you. You have teachers and counselors who are still there for you. The responsibility is not all on you. They are looking out for you. So when you're having a breakup, you'll be able to get over it or you'll be able to deal with it. But if it's on side gov, like Op will argue that when you go and have it for the first time when you're 19 years old in college away from your family, or since most like only 70%, only 7% of the world actually have a college education degree. But like, so if you just go directly into trade school or go like, to the workplace, you don't have your friends or family with you. You don't have a support system, which often means when you have the breakup when you're 19 or 20, that's way, way more emotionally devastating. You have way less experience of how to deal with relationships, which is why it's good to have them when you're a bit younger. So that's one thing. There's even another subsection about this where you can just argue like um things just things like on side opposition may argue like you will just sneak out if it's in a single sex school, you would sneak out and try and like meet up with a boy and do things that are not within the classroom or not within the school, and that can often be a bit more dangerous. Finally, I think there are like clashes around just like I put it down maybe as impact clashes. So, for example, where do girls earn or get higher marks is can be an impact based on where they get more confidence or where, for example, they get more attention. So, Gov could say that a single sex school just means that there is way more attention on these women, either because they tend to be smaller schools in some instances, or the like smaller schools in some instances, or even if they're not, at least like there's just a lot of concentrated resources just for these women. And op might say like, and gov might say like it's split on op between men and women. So there's a whole claim to be made around that. I think there are like some additional claims. So, for example, there's a claim around where sexist biases creep up more. So, Gov could so like opt for like well, Gov could say that if your teachers are disproportionately women in single sex schools, that kind of sexism from them reduces. Op may argue like an interesting, slightly counterintuitive flip, which is just basically like actually for a lot of teachers it's easier to be stricter on girls. For example, uh, if you're just teaching girls, because you don't fear that you have to show equal treatment. There is not a boy in the classroom to compare it to. So you might be on side opposition, worried about like being disproportionately harsh on women because you always fear that boys and girls will blame each other anytime there is perceived unfair treatment, and that can lead to like disruptions in the classroom, arguments. So a teacher may weirdly like sometimes in mixed gender classrooms not show their biases as much as they would in single sex classrooms. Like in many single sex schools, for example, there is like pretty strict norms, especially since I think you could make the argument actually that many single sex schools are like religiously affiliated. Like many in developing nations often have like some connection with the Catholic Church, for example. And those can often be like uniquely strict or harsh schools for a lot of girls. And that's not that same level of strictness when it's like a mixed gender school. So to summarize quickly, many possible clashes. What improves women's confidence? Where might they get better training for like the real world? Where they, for example, might like have better resources towards getting good, better at academics? Where, for example, they have more understanding of romantic relationships or like, at least conversations or friendships with men. There's a lot to be said, honestly. So yeah, this is hopefully like a quick, useful primer on what it could look like. Thanks.